"Princess, you still with us?" Drill Sergeant Deckard's voice was a gravel truck dumping its load across the frozen training yard. It sliced through the biting wind, a weapon in its own right. Or did your delicate sensibilities finally freeze over? Anya Sharma did not look up. Her focus remained on the disassembled rifle in her numb fingers. The cold had leached all feeling from them, turning the simple act of reassembling the bolt carrier group into a clumsy, painful puzzle. Metal stuck to bare skin. Every movement was a choice, a negotiation with the searing agony of the sub-zero air. She just needed to seat the firing pin retaining pin. Just that one last piece. The other recruits of Pike Platoon stood in a rigid formation, their breaths pluming like ghosts in the harsh glare of the floodlights. They stared straight ahead, their faces masks of strained neutrality. To look at Sharma was to invite Deckard's attention, and no one wanted that. They had learned that lesson over the last 6 brutal weeks of the Special Reconnaissance Selection Course. Sharma was a lightning rod, and they were all made of metal. "I asked you a question, Sharma," Deckard boomed, his massive frame eclipsing one of the floodlights as he stepped closer. He was a caricature of a drill sergeant, a man carved from granite and fury. His jaw was a constant knot of tension, his eyes perpetually narrowed in a state of simmering rage that he directed almost exclusively at the smallest recruit in the company. "Lost your tongue? Maybe it fell off with your dignity?" Sharma's fingers finally found their purchase. With a faint click, the pin slid home. She worked the charging handle. The sound crisp and final in the frozen air. She slapped the magazine into the well, pulled the handle again to chamber a dummy round, and placed the weapon on the snow-covered table in front of her. Assembled. She then raised her eyes to meet his. They were dark, steady, and held nothing. No fear, no anger, no defiance, just a placid, unnerving emptiness. "No, Drill Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, devoid of the tremor that afflicted most recruits when speaking to him. It was as calm as a frozen lake. "Weapon is reassembled, Drill Sergeant." Deckard stared at her, his own fury reflected in her still pupils. He had been trying to break her since day one. He had thrown every tool in his considerable arsenal of misery at her, and nothing worked. She never cried, never complained, never failed a task. She just endured. It was maddening. Her resilience was not an act of defiance, it was an act of erasure. It was as if he did not exist, as if his rage was just another weather condition to be weathered, like the wind or the snow. He saw her not as a soldier, but as a mistake, a product of some New Age diversity initiative that had infected the military's most elite echelons. She was 5'4", slender, with the face of a scholar, not a killer. She did not belong here, in this crucible designed to forge weapons from the hardest men the nation could produce. Her presence was an insult to the legacy he was sworn to uphold. "Is that so?" he sneered, leaning in until his face was inches from hers. The smell of stale coffee and contempt washed over her. "Well, isn't that special? The princess can put her toys back together. Let's see how well you handle a real task." He turned his head, his voice once again a physical force across the yard. "Pike Platoon, on your faces!" A collective groan, quickly suppressed, rippled through the ranks. 49 bodies dropped into the snow, preparing for the inevitable push-ups that would follow. Sharma remained standing. "Not you, Sharma," Deckard said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You get a special assignment. You see that berm?" He pointed to a massive pile of earth and snow at the far end of the training ground, nearly a quarter-mile away. "It's an affront to military discipline. I want it moved 10 feet to the left." The other recruits, now pushing against the frozen ground, understood. It was an impossible, pointless task. Sisyphean. It would take a front-end loader days to move that much earth. "You have 1 shovel, and until morning formation," Deckard continued. "Your platoon will remain in the push-up position until you have acknowledged your orders and begun your task. Is that understood?" The message was clear. Her suffering was not enough. Now her peers had to suffer with her, to feel the burn in their arms and the cold in their bones because of her. It was a classic isolation tactic designed to turn the unit against its weakest link. Sharma felt the weight of 49 pairs of eyes on her back, their silent resentment a palpable force. She gave a single, sharp nod. "Understood, drill sergeant." "Good girl," he whispered, the words dripping with condescension. He then bellowed to the rest of the platoon. "Hold that position until I get tired of watching her work." Sharma turned without a word, her movements economical and precise. She walked to the supply shed, retrieved a standard-issue entrenching tool, and began the long walk toward the berm. Each step was deliberate. She did not look back. The rhythmic count of Deckard forcing the platoon through another set of push-ups faded behind her, replaced by the crunch of her boots on the snow and the steady, quiet rhythm of her own breathing. "The mountain does not care about your anger," a voice in her head whispered. It was her father's voice, a memory from a childhood spent in places just as cold and unforgiving as this. "You just take the next step." She reached the berm. It loomed over her, a dark mountain of frozen soil and ice. She looked at it, then at the spot 10 feet to its left. She took a moment, calculating. Then she unfolded the shovel, chose a spot where the ground seemed loosest, and plunged the blade into the earth. The impact sent a jarring shock up her arms. The ground was like iron. She adjusted her stance, bent her knees, and tried again, and again, and again. The sound of her shovel striking the frozen ground became a lonely metronome in the vast, cold emptiness of the night. It was a sound of hopeless, stubborn persistence, and in the darkness she began her work. The campaign of harassment had begun on the first day, but it had grown in creativity and cruelty over the subsequent weeks. Deckard seemed to possess a bottomless well of malice specifically for Sharma. He made her carry the heaviest pack on their long-range marches, quietly adding sandbags to her ruck when he thought no one was looking. She never stumbled. He assigned her to clean the platoon's latrines with a toothbrush, a humiliating ritual performed under the scornful eyes of her peers. She had simply knelt and begun scrubbing, her movements methodical, her expression unreadable, leaving the ceramic gleaming with an almost fanatical cleanliness. He would wake her in the middle of the night for gear inspections, strewing the contents of her footlocker across the barracks floor and forcing her to repack it to regulation standards while she was sleep-deprived. She would do so perfectly, her hands moving with a practiced economy that betrayed a lifetime of discipline. Each test she passed, each ordeal she endured without breaking, seemed to fuel his rage further. He was trying to find a crack, a weakness, and her placid perfection was a constant denial of his power. The isolation tactic was his most effective tool. After the night of the berm, the platoon's simmering resentment had hardened into open hostility. They blamed her for the hours they had spent in the front-leaning rest, their muscles screaming in protest. They saw her not as a fellow soldier enduring a common hardship, but as the cause of their own suffering. "Stay away from the Jinx," a recruit named Gage had muttered, loud enough for her to hear. Gage was big, confident, and had quickly established himself as the platoon's alpha. He saw Sharma's presence as a personal affront, a dilution of the warrior ethos he aspired to. "Everything she touches turns to crap for the rest of us." The whispers followed her everywhere. In the mess hall, a space would clear around her as if she carried a contagion. During team-based exercises, she was always the last one picked, the unwanted burden. Her squad partners would speak to her only when necessary, their words clipped and cold. She was a ghost in their midst, present in body, but entirely alone. Through it all, Sharma remained a fortress of calm. Inwardly, she was not numb, she was focused. Each insult, each grueling punishment was simply data. It was an obstacle to be navigated, not an attack to be felt. Her father had trained her for this, though neither of them had known it at the time. He had been a man who spoke in parables and lessons, teaching her survival in the wild landscapes where he had raised her. She remembered a time when she was 12, lost during a blizzard on a mountainside. Panic had begun to set in, a cold fear more chilling than the wind. He had found her, not with a frantic search, but by calmly tracking her steps. He had not scolded her. He had simply handed her a thermos of hot tea and sat with her in the snow cave he'd dug. "The storm doesn't hate you, Anya," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "It is just being a storm. You can't fight it. You can't reason with it. You can only be smarter than it. You endure it, and you wait for your moment to move." Drill Sergeant Deckard was just another storm, a loud, predictable, and ultimately insignificant weather pattern. She would endure him. She would be smarter than him, and she would wait for her moment to move. She spent her nights not sleeping, but studying. While the others collapsed into their bunks, exhausted, she would sit at the edge of her cot with a small, shielded flashlight, poring over topographical maps and tide charts. Practicing celestial navigation tables she had long since memorized. She field-stripped her weapon in the dark until the process was pure muscle memory, an extension of her own hands. She was not just surviving the course, she was mastering its every element in the shadows, far from Deckard's sight. Her body, though slight, was a marvel of efficiency. Her father had taught her to run for miles without tiring, to control her breathing, to lower her heart rate at will. What Deckard saw as fragility was actually a lack of waste. She carried no excess muscle, no unnecessary tension. Every ounce of her being was honed for endurance. One afternoon, during a particularly brutal obstacle course run, Deckard had ordered her to climb a 30-foot rope. This, he thought, would be her breaking point. She lacked the upper body mass of the men who muscled their way up. As she approached the rope, Gage and his friends snickered. "Better call for a ladder, Princess." Sharma ignored them. She took the rope, but instead of using a standard gym class technique, she wrapped it around her leg in a swift, complex knot her father had taught her, a climber's friction hitch. Then, using her legs to push and her arms merely to guide, she ascended the rope with an unnervingly smooth, spider-like grace. She barely seemed to be exerting herself. She reached the top, slapped the beam, and descended just as smoothly, landing silently on her feet. The snickering stopped. For a brief moment, the platoon saw not a weak woman, but something else, something they could not quite define. Deckard's face went purple with rage. He opened his mouth to scream, but for once no words came out. He just pointed a trembling finger at the next obstacle, his mask of control momentarily shattered. It was the first crack, not in her, but in him. And Sharma, in her quiet way, noted it. The storm was growing louder, which meant it was getting closer to blowing itself out. In an office overlooking the bleak training grounds, Captain Eva Rostova stared at a screen full of data, a frown creasing her brow. Rostova was the company's executive officer, a woman who believed in numbers, regulations, and fairness. And the numbers on Private Sharma were not adding up. According to every metric, marksmanship scores, timed runs, land navigation accuracy, obstacle course completion. Sharma was in the top 5% of the candidates. Her biometrics were even more impressive. Her heart rate during high-stress events barely fluctuated. Her recovery times were minutes faster than the platoon average. On paper, she was an ideal candidate. But then there were the subjective reports filed daily by Drill Sergeant Deckard. Lacks aggression. Hesitant under pressure. Poor team integration. Questionable motivation. Overall performance, marginal. Candidate is not recommended for continuation. The disconnect was jarring. It was as if Deckard was describing a completely different soldier. Rostova had served with Deckard for 2 years. He was a hard man, but usually a fair judge of talent. This felt different. It felt personal. "Get me Private Sharma's 201 file," she ordered her clerk. "The original hard copy, from records." An hour later, the file was on her desk. It was thin, which was normal for a new recruit. But as she flipped through it, she saw something that was not normal at all. Several pages, including sections on family history and prior specialized training, were redacted. Not just classified, but physically blacked out with a heavy marker, the kind used by intelligence agencies to sanitize documents. And on the very first page, stapled to her enlistment contract, was a small, cream-colored card with a single typed line. "By order of SOCOM Command, observe only, do not interfere." Rostova sat back in her chair, a low whistle escaping her lips. Special Operations, Command itself. She had never seen such a directive on an enlisted recruit's file. It was the kind of thing reserved for high-level operatives, foreign dignitaries, or clandestine assets. Who was this quiet, unassuming woman who was being tormented daily by her drill sergeant? Her curiosity now fully piqued, Rostova began to dig deeper, using her own clearance to bypass the lower-level blocks. She found fragments. A birth certificate from a U.S. military hospital in Okinawa. School records from a dozen different countries. A note indicating the completion of several non-standard survival and evasion courses before her enlistment, with the course provider listed only as K. Sharma. The name meant nothing to her. She decided on a more direct approach. Citing a mandatory medical follow-up, she had Sharma brought to her office. When the private entered, she moved with a quiet poise that seemed at odds with the recruit uniform she wore. She stood at attention in front of Rostova's desk, her gaze fixed on the wall just over her shoulder. At ease. "Private," Rostova said, gesturing to a chair. Sharma sat, her back perfectly straight, her hands resting on her knees. "I'll be direct, Sharma. My data says you're one of the best candidates we have. Your drill sergeant's reports say you're one of the worst. Help me understand the discrepancy." Sharma's expression did not change. "I follow all lawful orders to the best of my ability, Captain. I meet or exceed all published standards for this course." It was a perfect by-the-book answer. It was also a complete evasion. "Drill Sergeant Deckard seems to believe you lack the proper military bearing," Rostova pressed. He describes you as passive. Passivity and patience are not the same thing, Captain, Sharma replied, her voice still level. I am here to learn, to endure, and to pass this course. My personal feelings about the training methods are irrelevant. Rostova leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Your file is unusual. Large sections are redacted. There's a note from SOCOM. You understand this is highly irregular. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in Sharma's eyes. It wasn't fear, but perhaps a hint of weariness. I am aware of my administrative status, Captain. I am not at liberty to discuss it. And this K. Sharma, who administered your prior training? Rostova asked, watching her reaction closely. Anya Sharma's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. A ghost of a memory seemed to pass behind her eyes. He was my father, she said simply. He taught me things he thought were important. Rostova felt she was on the verge of something significant, but the walls were up again. Sharma was a closed book, written in a language Rostova did not understand. She was a quiet professional trapped in a recruit's body, playing a role for reasons Rostova could not fathom. Very well, Private, Rostova said, her voice tinged with a new respect. I am logging a formal note of the discrepancy between your performance data and Drill Sergeant Deckard's evaluations. For now, my official advice to you is to continue to meet the standards and try to stay off the sergeant's radar. That may no longer be possible, Captain, Sharma said, her voice holding a new, almost imperceptible note of gravity. Why is that? Because we are entering the final phase, Sharma replied. The long walk. He will not allow me to pass. Rostova looked at the young woman before her. She saw the quiet certainty in her eyes and felt a chill. Sharma wasn't afraid. She was making a prediction, and Rostova had the sinking feeling that she was about to witness a collision she was powerless to stop. She dismissed the private, then spent the rest of the afternoon trying and failing to find any official record of a man named K. Sharma. The system acted as if he had never existed. The final phase of selection, the long walk, was legendary. It was a 5-day, 150-kilometer forced march through the most inhospitable terrain the Alaskan wilderness had to offer. Each squad was given a series of coordinates, a limited supply of rations, and the expectation that they would navigate from point to point, performing complex reconnaissance tasks along the way. It was a test of endurance, navigation, and teamwork, designed to be the final filter that separated the capable from the elite. The briefing was held in a large, heated hangar. Colonel Marks, the base commander, stood before the exhausted candidates. "This is not a race," he said, his voice grim. "This is a test of precision. Your GPS units are encrypted, your digital compasses are calibrated. Your objective is to arrive at each rendezvous point on time and with your entire squad intact. Weather is a factor. Your gear is a factor. But your biggest enemy out there will be the 6 inches between your ears." As he spoke, a low hum began to fill the hangar. It was a subtle vibration at first, the kind you felt in your teeth. Then the lights flickered violently. On the large digital map behind the colonel, the display dissolved into a cascade of green and white static. The GPS unit on the demonstration table went dead. Every screen in the room blinked out, one by one. A murmur of confusion and anxiety spread through the recruits. The colonel's staff began speaking into their radios, their voices sharp with alarm. "What the hell was that?" Gage muttered from his place in the formation. Sharma felt it too, but not as confusion. She felt a strange tingling on her skin, a familiar pressure in the air. She had felt it once before when her father was teaching her about the sun, about its invisible storms that could reach across millions of miles of space to wipe away man's cleverest inventions. Drill Sergeant Deckard stood at the side of the formation, and a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. He had been waiting for a moment like this, an act of God, a flaw in the system that he could exploit. The chaos was an opportunity. He saw not a crisis, but a gift. He strode to the center of the room, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "All right, shut your holes, so the fancy toys are broken. A real soldier doesn't need satellites to find his way. A real soldier uses a map, a compass, and the brain God gave him." His eyes scanned the crowd and locked on to Sharma. This was it, the perfect stage, a public, undeniable, and catastrophic failure. He walked over to Sharma's squad, Pike 3. "Pike 3, on your feet!" he barked. The 5 members of the squad, including a nervous-looking Gage, scrambled to attention. Deckard addressed the squad, but his eyes never left Sharma. "Looks like your squad needs a leader, someone with real grit, but since we're short on that, we'll have to make do." He turned to face the entire company. "We have a candidate here who, according to the brass, is a special kind of soldier. So, let's give her a special kind of test. Private Sharma." Sharma stepped forward. The hangar fell silent. Everyone was watching. "Your squad's electronics are fried," Deckard announced, his voice dripping with mock solemnity. "All you have is this." He held up a standard topographical map. "And this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a lensatic compass. With a deliberate, theatrical movement, he smashed it against the metal leg of a table. The glass cracked and the needle spun uselessly. He tossed the broken instrument at her feet. "A map and a broken compass," he declared. "And your wits. Your squad's objective is Rendezvous Point Delta. It's 100 kilometers through the Iskut Range. The route crosses 2 glaciers and a ravine. You have 96 hours. Lead them there." "Princess?" A wave of shock and disbelief washed over the recruits. It was a death sentence. No GPS, no compass, in a mountain range notorious for whiteout conditions and treacherous, shifting ice. Even with perfect gear, it was a brutal challenge. This was impossible. It was murder. Gage looked from Deckard to Sharma, his face pale with fear and anger. "Drill Sergeant, that's not—" "Are you questioning my order, Corporal?" Deckard snapped, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. Gage's mouth clamped shut. He looked at Sharma with a mixture of pity and contempt. This was her fault. Her existence had brought this doom upon them. All eyes were now on Sharma. They expected her to protest, to refuse, to break down. This was the moment Deckard had been engineering for weeks. The final public humiliation. Sharma bent down and picked up the broken compass. She glanced at it for a moment, then looked at the map. Her face was a mask of concentration. She showed no fear, no despair. She simply looked at the challenge laid before her as if it were an equation to be solved. She looked up, her gaze meeting Deckard's. "Understood, Drill Sergeant," she said, her voice clear and calm. She then turned to her stunned squad mates. "Pike 3, check your gear. We're moving out in 5. The squad stared at her as if she were insane. But there was a new quality in her voice, a quiet authority they had never heard before. It was the voice of someone who was no longer playing a role. The test had begun, and Anya Sharma had just accepted the challenge. The 5 members of Pike 3 moved out into the biting wind, a palpable cloud of despair hanging over them. They were following a ghost, a woman leading them into a frozen grave. Gage walked just behind Sharma, his anger a hot coal in his chest. This was a suicide mission, a farce designed by a sadistic drill sergeant, and she had just walked right into it. They marched for an hour in grim silence, following the edge of a frozen river. Sharma was at point, her pace steady and relentless. She didn't look at the useless broken compass. She didn't seem to be looking at the map. She was looking at everything else, the angle of the weak afternoon sun, the faint scour lines on the rocks, the direction the snow was drifting. As dusk began to settle, tinting the endless expanse of white and gray with shades of purple and orange, she called a halt. "We'll make camp here for the night," she announced. "Camp? We've barely made 5 kilometers, Gage spat, throwing his pack down in frustration. "At this rate, they'll find our frozen bodies in the spring. We need to push on." Sharma turned to him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "Push on where, Corporal? Into the dark? We need the stars. We push on at 0200. She then proceeded to direct the setup of their cold-weather tents with an unnerving efficiency, pointing out the best location to minimize wind exposure. As total darkness fell, the sky cleared, revealing a breathtaking canopy of stars, brighter and sharper in the thin, cold air than any of them had ever seen. The other squad members huddled together, rationing their food, their moods as dark as the night. Sharma stood apart, looking up. She pulled a small waterproof notebook and a pencil from a pouch on her belt. She held up her hand to the sky, fingers spread, thumb extended. She was measuring angles between the horizon and Polaris, angles between constellations. She made notations in her book, her pencil scratching quietly in the immense silence. She was doing something ancient, something they had only read about in historical manuals. Gage watched her, a cynical sneer on his face. "What's the matter, Princess? Trying to find your horoscope?" Sharma didn't rise to the bait. "That's Cassiopeia," she said, her voice quiet. "And that's the Big Dipper. If you draw a line from the 2 outer stars of the Dipper's Cup, it points directly to Polaris, the North Star. Its height above the horizon gives you your latitude. We're at 56 degrees, 48 minutes north." She made another note. The time, based on the rotation of the Dipper around Polaris, is approximately 21:30 local. She then pointed to a bright star near the horizon. "That's Vega. In 2 hours, Arcturus will rise in the east. That will give us our heading. We will travel at a bearing of 283 degrees until sunrise." The squad fell silent. This wasn't a guess. It was a calculation. It was a level of knowledge that was both arcane and absolute. The scorn on Gage's face was replaced by a flicker of confusion. At 0200, as promised, she woke them. She pointed out the new star, gave them the bearing, and they set off into the darkness, Sharma leading the way with an eerie confidence. She moved as if she had an illuminated map in her head. When the sun rose, she didn't stop. She glanced at the map for the first time, correlating the terrain features, a distinctive peak, a sharp bend in a frozen river, with her position. Her dead reckoning during the night had been flawless. They were exactly where she said they would be. Now she used the sun. She had one of the men plant a stick in the snow and watched its shadow. "The shortest shadow will mark local noon," she explained, not to them, but as if reciting a lesson. "That gives us true south. The sun moves at 15 degrees per hour. We can calculate our heading from that." For 2 days this continued. She was a human navigation computer. She used the wind, noting how it consistently sculpted the snow into wave-like patterns called sastrugi, all aligned with the prevailing direction. She used the faint, almost invisible lichen that grew more thickly on the north-facing sides of rocks. She was reading a language written into the landscape itself, a language the rest of them were completely blind to. The squad's attitude underwent a profound transformation. The resentment and fear evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of awe. They stopped questioning her. They started protecting her. When she stopped to take a reading, they would form a perimeter around her, shielding her from the wind. They made sure she ate first. They watched her with a reverence usually reserved for a bomb disposal expert. She was their only hope, and she was performing a miracle. Gage was the most transformed of all. The arrogant corporal was gone, replaced by a humbled, focused soldier. He stayed close to her, no longer to mock, but to learn. "How do you know this?" he asked during a short break, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. "My father taught me," she said, her eyes on the horizon. "He said that technology is a convenience, not a skill. A skill is something that can't be taken from you. It lives inside your head." On the morning of the fourth day, they crested a ridge. Below them, nestled in a valley, was a small cluster of tents and a communications antenna. A thin plume of smoke rose from a stovepipe. It was Rendezvous Point Delta. They had arrived a full 24 hours ahead of schedule. They walked into the camp. A pair of instructors, hardened veterans assigned to evaluate the arriving teams, looked up from their coffee, their faces etched with utter disbelief. "Pike 3 reporting," Sharma said, her voice steady despite the 4 days of brutal exertion. All 5 members present and accounted for. One of the instructors tapped the coordinates on his own, fully functional GPS. He looked at the spot where Sharma and her squad stood, then back at his screen. He did it again. "My God," he whispered to his partner. "They're dead on, not within 100 meters. They are standing on the exact grid coordinate." The camp fell into a stunned silence. The instructors, the support staff, everyone just stared at the 5 soldiers who had emerged from the wilderness, led by the small, quiet woman who stood before them. They had done the impossible. Just as the full weight of their achievement began to settle, the rhythmic whump, whump, whump of an approaching helicopter echoed through the valley. It was not a standard transport. It was a Black Hawk, sleek and dark, the kind used by the highest echelons of command. It landed in a whirlwind of snow and rotor wash, and the side door slid open. A tall, lean officer with the silver eagle of a colonel on his collar stepped out. He moved with an air of absolute authority. It was Colonel Vance, the commander of the entire Special Operations Training Command. His face was a mask of grim purpose. Vance strode directly past the stunned instructors and toward Pike 3. His eyes scanned the squad, checking their condition with a practiced glance. "Report," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Pike 3 reporting, sir," Sharma said, her back straight. "We navigated from Point Alpha to Delta as ordered." Vance's gaze settled on her. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a deep, weary confirmation. "Who was your navigator?" "I was, sir," Sharma replied. At that moment, a second helicopter, a smaller utility craft, landed nearby. Drill Sergeant Deckard climbed out, a look of smug triumph on his face. He had come to see the proof of Sharma's failure, to find her squad lost and broken. Seeing them standing there, whole and on time, wiped the smirk from his face, replacing it with pure, unadulterated shock. He walked toward the group, his confusion turning to anger. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice returning to its familiar bellow. "How did you get here?" Colonel Vance turned his head slowly to face Deckard. The look in his eyes was colder than the glacier that loomed over the valley. "That is an outstanding question, Sergeant." "Sir," Deckard stammered, belatedly recognizing the colonel. He snapped to attention. "Drill Sergeant Deckard, I was just—" "I know who you are, Deckard," Vance cut him off. "And I know what you did." He gestured back toward the mountains. "That solar flare wasn't part of your test. It was a Carrington-level event. It has knocked out communications and navigation systems across the entire hemisphere. The other 7 teams in this exercise are currently lost. We have a major search and rescue operation underway, trying to find them before they freeze to death. This squad is the only one we are not looking for." The color drained from Deckard's face. This wasn't a training scenario anymore. This was a real-world disaster. His petty personal test had put lives at risk. Vance took a step closer to Deckard, his voice dropping to a low, lethal tone. "You took a squad of candidates, sent them into a 100-kilometer kill zone with no navigation equipment during a geomagnetic storm as a punishment. You did it to break one soldier." "Sir, I was testing her. I was pushing her to her limits." "It's my job to weed out the weak," Deckard pleaded, his bluster dissolving into desperation. "You weren't testing her," Vance said, his voice like cracking ice. "You were indulging your own bigotry and incompetence. You saw a small woman and you assumed she was weak. You failed to read her file. You failed to see the asset right in front of your face." Vance turned and looked at Sharma. "I served with your father, Private. Sergeant Major Kenji Sharma was the finest navigator and survivalist this Army has ever produced. He wrote the doctrine on analog navigation for deep reconnaissance units. He could navigate his way out of hell with a handful of sand and a prayer. I see he taught his daughter well." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. The name, whispered with reverence by the colonel, connected all the dots. The redacted file. The impossible skill, the unnerving calm. She wasn't just a recruit. She was royalty. Vance turned back to Deckard, his face a mask of cold fury. "You are a disgrace to the uniform of a non-commissioned officer. You don't build soldiers. You break them. Or you try to. You are hereby relieved of your duties as a drill sergeant. You are relieved of your authority. You are, for all intents and purposes, relieved of your career." He turned to one of the instructors. "Sergeant, place this man under escort. He can contemplate his failure while he awaits his Article 15. Deckard stood there, utterly broken, his face a ruin of shattered arrogance. The instructor, who had watched Deckard's abuse for weeks, took a grim satisfaction in grabbing his arm. "Let's go, Mr. Deckard." As he was led away, a failure in the eyes of the very institution he claimed to embody, the silent, snowy valley seemed to pass its own final judgment. Colonel Vance walked over to Sharma, the hardness in his eyes softened to something akin to paternal respect. "Your father would be proud, Anya." It was the first time anyone on the base had used her first name. "He would also be furious that I pulled you out of his alma mater in Nepal to put you through this circus, but we had to vet you." "I understand, sir," she said. "No, you don't, but you will," Vance replied. "This selection course is over for you. Your real training was completed a long time ago. We have a flight waiting. There's real work to do." He was not giving her an order, He was stating a fact. Her time as an outcast was officially over. As she walked toward the waiting Black Hawk, a figure stepped into her path. It was Corporal Gage. He stood rigidly at the position of attention, his face etched with a shame and respect that was profoundly sincere. "Private Sharma," he said, his voice clear and steady. "On behalf of the squad, on behalf of myself, I was wrong. What you did, it was an honor to serve with you." He raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute. Anya Sharma looked at him. She saw not the bully from the barracks, but a soldier who had seen the truth and had the character to admit it. She gave him a single, small nod of acknowledgment, a gesture of forgiveness and shared experience that was more powerful than any words. Then she turned and boarded the helicopter, leaving the world of recruits and drill sergeants behind forever. The story of what happened in the Iskut Range spread like wildfire through the special operations community. The tale of the quiet private who navigated her squad to safety through a geomagnetic storm with nothing but the stars and the wind became a new legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimation. Months later, thousands of miles away, a man in a private's uniform was on his hands and knees, scrubbing a grimy floor with a small brush. His name was Deckard. His new home was Thule Air Base in Greenland, the northernmost outpost of the U.S. Armed Forces. His new job was permanent latrine duty. Every day, as he scoured the filth, he was haunted by the memory of a quiet woman's face and the cold, clear voice of a colonel dismantling his entire world. It was a quiet, cold, and lonely end to a loud, arrogant career. In a classified briefing room deep inside a mountain command center, Anya Sharma stood before a massive, holographic map of a hostile mountain range in Central Asia. She was no longer a private. The insignia on her collar marked her as a specialist in a unit so secret it didn't officially exist. She pointed to a specific, impossibly steep ridge on the map. "The satellite coverage here is non-existent, and their ECM will fry any drone we send," a general was saying. "Infiltration looks impossible." Anya leaned closer to the map, her eyes tracing invisible lines across the terrain. "It's not impossible," she said, her voice still quiet, but now filled with the weight of hard-earned authority. "There's a route. The prevailing winds at this altitude create a specific snow pattern on the leeward side of this ridge. It will provide cover. And at night, the constellation Lyra will be directly overhead." The generals and colonels in the room fell silent, listening with rapt attention. They saw not a small woman, but a master of her craft, a living weapon whose skills could not be jammed, hacked, or broken. The quiet professional had found her place, not by shouting her worth, but by proving it when it mattered most, navigating by the steady, silent light of distant stars.